Welcome to Interfaithing, a podcast for and about Jewish and Christian interfaith families,
where we explore the question, why families can embrace two faiths under one roof.
I'm Ari, the son of a rabbi,
with a degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary.
I'm Anna, the daughter of a minister with a degree from the Union Theological Seminary. We were co-teachers together at the interfaith community in New York.
And 1 year of working together led to 15 years of friendship and collaboration.
To find us sitting here today, embarking on a new project.
Whether you are part of an interfaith family,
or you're exploring and interested in how different faiths interact with one another,
this is the space for you.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And help us spread the Torah and gospel of interfaith wisdom far and wide.
And you'll also gain access to exclusive content like our holiday live stream events.
We hope you enjoy every episode.
Listen at your own pace.
Share with a friend.
And don't forget to subscribe.
This episode, we are unpacking the myth of you're a traitor.
By forming an interfaith family, you are causing a rupture.
And welcome again, everyone, to another edition of Interfaithing, Why Families Can Embrace Two Faiths Under One Roof. I'm your co-host, Ari Sachs, and I'm here joined by my very good friend and interfaithing co-teacher, Anna DeWeese. Hello, Anna.
Hello, hello. Once
wow.
again.
Look at that. Hear that sound. I hear someone got a very special Christmas gift.
Yes.
Santa left you a very special something under the tree.
Yes. Santa Claus is so happy and impressed with our interfaithing podcast that calling back to episode 3 wanted us to level up our audio quality and also responding to a website comment that was left, wanting to make sure that the audio between the both of us and for the stories was as good as it could be. So
amazing.
Firstly, we appreciate that feedback.
Absolutely.
And for those of you who are just tuning in or haven't checked us out beyond the podcast yet, please go to interfaithingpod.com, where you can also stream the episodes straight from the website and also leave us feedback.
Absolutely. You can learn more about what it is that we're doing. Check out our Patreon site, patreon.com/interfaithing, so that you can be able to support our work. You'll be able to read things that we post on there about what is it we're trying to do and how we're looking to help make the world a little bit better, one interfaith family at a time with this podcast. Well, tonight is, as we often say, a very juicy topic, a very good one. We expect to get a lot of great sound bites. This topic is probably the most ancient of the myths associated with interfaithing. And that is the myth that if you marry somebody from a different faith tradition and build a family together, that you are a traitor to your faith tradition, to your family, to your community, to all the generations that came before you. You are showing that you just don't care and that you are leaving that tradition out of a sense of spite, anger, whatever it might be.
Yes, indeed. What you are doing by making this decision, by choosing to be in an interfaith relationship, and then by forming an interfaith family, you are causing a rupture in your previous relationships, meaning that you are now responsible for the pain and suffering of your extended family, of other friends, of other people from the community that raised you. Like that is the level of intensity that we're talking about in using the word traitor, because that is not a small thing.
So I think that if you take a long look throughout history, if you have a faith-based community, that community would generally live in a specific place. Well, if you end up being excommunicated from that place because of a choice that you make, and marrying a person of a different faith tradition, this is one of those choices. Well, where do you belong? Because it might very well be that you are not safe in one space and you're not safe in the other space. You're not safe in your faith tradition space and you're not safe in the faith tradition of your spouse. And so where do you actually belong? Funny enough, the idea of cities, of places where people from
Mhm.
different cultures would come together and live in this metropolitan
Mm.
society was also the idea that you would have a geographic location for people who did not necessarily fit within the context of the particular locales associated with different cultures or different faith traditions. This is definitely true of, let's say, Amsterdam in the medieval period was a place for also free thinkers. So it also comes back to the point that we've said many times about finding community, right?
Mhm.
The idea that if you decide to marry somebody, if you decide to raise a family, especially with any concept of multiple faith traditions, that it's hard to find places in which you can really rest your head and say, I belong here.
Yeah, indeed. And just a reminder, this notion of being excommunicated, of being kicked out of one's family, one's community, one's faith tradition, that is also not just something of the past. That is not a historic topic. It is, in
Mhm.
fact, like still something that people experience today. They may
Right.
not use that terminology, but losing contact with someone's families because of your life choices. Unfortunately,
Happens
lots
a
of
lot.
people, yeah, it happens all the time. And within faith traditions, right? Like so many of our queer brothers and sisters who were raised in faith traditions have experienced exactly this. Being told if you want to live your life a particular way, you are no longer welcome here. And I can only say that from the Christian tradition, it is especially heartbreaking because the gospel, the
Mm,
the lesson, the example of Jesus is about such unconditional, all abiding love and acceptance of those outcast from society that to see Christian communities acting in this way, whether it's to queer folks, whether it's to interracial or other intermarried families, is just really painful
yeah,
to see still happening. But it is
and
not only an historic experience either.
right. It is not something that is of the past. It is something that is very much in the here and now. And what I can also offer from the Jewish tradition and the Jewish experience of question of is interfaithing positive for aspects of propagating Jews for the next generation? This particular question is not as much centered on a theological level, but on the sense of Jewish continuity, which I've mentioned before in my
Mm,
origin story. And while I'm not involved in this work, particularly for purposes of Jewish continuity, I'm in this because of the faith connection that God is inspiring by virtue of saying there are many different paths to connect to me. And here's a beautiful way that it's happening in the world. And how can you really raise that to a higher level? That for many folks who are involved in this work, Jewish continuity is very much a part of the world of interfaithing, of the idea that with a partner of a different faith tradition, even as we explore what that looks like in our family household, I'm absolutely invested in wanting to instill Jewish values and Jewish traditions with my child, with my children, so that Judaism can continue on. And then when you hear comments that to marry somebody of a different faith tradition, to intermarry, it is as if you're perpetuating the Holocaust in this generation,
mm,
right? Think about the pain that that statement causes. The
yeah.
most terrible atrocity, the attempted genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis, 6 million Jewish brothers and sisters who were killed. And to say that you are continuing that project by virtue of marrying somebody of a different faith tradition, like that is just pain. And how would you
Yeah.
even want to then continue to associate yourself with this spiritual faith tradition. I can understand why some would just basically say, like, to heck with it. And there are many folks who that feeling kind of still resonates. And
Hmm.
so some of the stories I think that you're going to hear today are going to be a little bit painful along those lines in terms of what that experience is like for families to hear, to feel as if they're being called a traitor to their own tradition by virtue of intermarrying. But
Yeah.
those stories are important for all of us to hear, regardless of one's own perspective, because they are true to the individuals themselves, and they are also important markers for our larger communities to help us understand what we need to do in order to really embrace these families who are becoming more popular, with more couples who are intermarrying in a variety of different ways. And the last thing I'll just say on this is that some of that feeling of that traitorous vibe, if you will, are also coming from some of the couples who are intermarried, sometimes are experiencing that kind of pain that they've internalized, whether it was because of things that they were taught earlier in their lives, or things that they're even thinking about how hard it might be for them to sit in a church service. And so, what does it mean that interfaith couples themselves may be harboring some of these sentiments of, am I a traitor? Am I turning my back on my people, on my faith tradition, on my community, on my family?
Mm.
So, what can we do to help meet those couples where they are, to help those families continue to persevere into this next iteration of faith life for them and for the larger American world?
Indeed. Yeah. This is going to be, as you said, there might be pain, right? We're going to be
Mhm.
hearing people's pain points. And at least today, the story that I'm going to start us off with also resolution,
Hmm. That'll be nice to hear. So
right?
again,
And
yeah.
and
No,
not
please.
not perfection, right? Like always take the idea of perfection out of your minds. That's not what we're striving for. There's no such thing as a perfect human experience. We're all flawed. That's why we're human. And also the recognition that nothing like this isn't a sitcom, right?
Hmm.
That there was a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it all took place within 25 minutes, excluding commercial breaks. And then at the end, everyone was like hugging
Oh.
and things were great. No, time has to pass. People have to sit with these questions, wrestle with them. From the South, we like to say you got to chew the fat like until all the
Hmm.
flavor is gone to really get under these issues
Hmm.
in order to get to the other side.
Right. Well, I cannot wait to chew the fat with you on these stories. So, for our listeners, especially if this is your first time, we're going to have a couple stories to share with you. Anna's going to go first. And then this is a story that I've never heard before, but I'm going to then offer my hot take on it. And then I'm going to offer a story, and Anna will offer her hot take on that as well. Can't wait to get ourselves started. So, with that, Anna, would you like to introduce your first story for today?
Yes, I would. I'm going to try to keep this as a very brief introduction. Our two speakers that you're going to hear both have some really brilliant insights in being in conversation with one another. So, this is coming from the two spiritual leaders of the Interfaith Family Project, IFFP.
If you've just joined us, we were introduced to Rabbi Debbie Reichman and Reverend Samantha Gonzalez Block of the Interfaith Families Project of Washington, D.C. in Myth Number 1, Part 1, Judaism and Christianity do not mix. They're just too different.
And how, as the clergy slash spiritual leaders, had to respond to family members grappling with, but I think my fill in the blank child is a traitor.
Right. And so here is Rabbi Debbie and Reverend Samantha.
Hey Sam, it's nice to see you again, as
Hi,
always.
Debbie. Always a pleasure.
I was thinking about our conversation last time, and I remembered one of the most painful conversations I ever had with not actually a couple I was going to marry, But one of their moms, the Jewish mom and the Jewish spouse-to-be, said, would you be willing to talk to my mom? She's really upset. And I said, yeah, of course, I'm happy to do that, which I always am. And this mom, she was a wreck. The spouse-to-be wasn't wrong. And the mom just felt that her child was being a traitor to everything she had ever done for them and raising them. And I could hear the anguish in her voice, which was so painful. I'm totally compassionate towards her. Actually, before I even tell you this story, my aunt, my mother's sister, decided to marry a Catholic, and my grandfather was going to disown her and sit Shiva and say all sorts, and just say, I'm done. And my parents, so my mom and my dad, sat with him and said, if you do this, you're cutting her off forever. Is that really what you want to do? And he said, well, I guess not. And he decided not to. He even went to the wedding, which is great because that particular marriage did not last long and was really a mess. So my aunt actually needed to come home and have someone love her and care for her. And my grandfather appreciated that he was in a position to do that. So that's like my family background. But this other mom, hadn't gone through it yet. She was still in step one, which is I'm losing a child. My child is turned on me. And I listened to all this angst, and I know where it comes from, especially, the older the generations get, the closer to World War II and the Holocaust, they take it, and rightly so, very personally, very emotionally. So I was listening to this mom and how she was berating herself. She's like, where did I mess up? How did I raise my child wrong? Some of the things I usually say weren't going to be useful to her. This is an opportunity to learn something new. She doesn't want to learn it. But how could I reframe her child's behavior for her in a way that she can move on?
So what'd you do?
That's such a good question. Well, I shared actually the story of my family and how keeping relations was so important, and how for her, if she could just find a way to still love her child and stay involved, and that time was going to help. So time is a huge healer. But also the fact that her child was including the rabbi in the discussion, in the wedding, in the planning, in reaching out to me to talk to her, was such a practical acknowledgement of the fact that they didn't want to give up their Judaism. They were going to take it forward into their lives as newly married people, into their lives of their future children if they were going to have it. It just wasn't the way she had imagined it, but it was still there. And it took a while, and I know she didn't want to hear it probably the first 10 times I said it, but I do know by the time the wedding rolls around, there were smiles, not tears, and the vibe on that day was much better than I would have expected otherwise. So I think just sharing with her that she'd know if it was a true case of you're a traitor, they wouldn't have even bothered with me. They wouldn't have bothered with being Jewish at all, with having a Jewish element. So I basically told her and other people who have been in this situation to focus on where they are still engaged, because you can grow things.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can really resonate with your story. And I have good friends, too, that grandfather was ready to sit Shiva for his son who was marrying outside of the faith, outside of Judaism. And his modern Orthodox rabbi said, similarly, if you cut your grandson off, you've lost all influence on him and his children, and he's not going to get that richness of your experience and of your tradition if he can't have access to it, if he can't have access to you. And that really was a game changer. And it does, I think, really show that it really takes somebody just changing the narrative a little bit, seeing the positive of the experience. It takes, I think, somebody kind of supporting this couple to sometimes shift the game a little bit and open people's minds to something a little bit bigger. I had an experience with a couple that I married, and this wasn't a Jewish Christian couple, this was a Muslim Hindu couple who were good friends of mine, and the father of the groom was so upset that his son was marrying outside of their tradition that he was basically ready to disown his son. And he didn't want anything to do with the wedding. He wasn't eating. It was a very dramatic experience. And then, of course, they asked me, the Jewish Presbyterian girl, to do their wedding, which I was like, do you really want to bring me into the mix? But what I found was he did end up attending the wedding because his daughter said, if you're not attending, I'm not going to forgive you for this. This is your son. You need to be there. And so he was there. And I remember officiating this wedding and feeling like I had this really important obligation to make sure this family could meet the bride who they wanted nothing to do with. I wanted them to know who she was. I wanted them to understand what their relationship meant to them. And so really my ceremony was sort of like this introduction to who she is, who he is, and what they mean to each other. And I think it was a game changer, because I think they hadn't looked past her religion to really realize that, oh my gosh, this is the perfect person for my son. And this is a woman of deep faith and integrity and compassion. And it really shifted things for them, as opposed to thinking this could never work, or my son is betraying, everything that we taught him.
That's an amazing point. I mean, it's a great story. But to also look at the other partner, and I think I've done this as well, and said, look, your child's partner is with them on this path and is willing to engage with the Jewish aspect and is willing and wanting to make this a happy occasion for everyone. And they're a great person. I've actually even had at least one mom tell me how wonderful the non-Jewish spouse was, but that she was still torn about it. And when she said that, I was like, well, let's focus. You love this person. You recognize how wonderful they are. So their only quote-unquote flaw is religion. Can we make that a non-flaw? Instead of it's a bug, it's a feature. What about this can we grow from? Because you get to teach this person what you value about Judaism.
Wow.
I know, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one really hits the nail on the head in terms of what we're talking about.
I know. I'm like, thanks, Rabbi Debbie and Rabbi Sam. Like, boom, knocked it out of the park. Home
Right.
run, straight out the gate. And I love that little soundbite from Rabbi Debbie, right? Of it's not a bug, it's a feature.
Right.
Maybe it's the mental health administrator in me that's just like, look at that positive reframe. I love it. I'm here for it,
It
And
also, by the second story from Rev Sam about the notion of here is this person who is the perfect person
mhm,
for your son, for your grandson, right?
yeah.
And that her job was to introduce them. I mean, that I think is just a beautiful way of expressing it, that here is two people coming together where in flashing red lights, the first thing that comes to mind is who is this person? Jew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
And how those names and how those titles seem to indicate whether they're in, they're out, they belong, they don't belong. The assumption of how our own particular views of that other faith tradition then kind of play into how terrible is it? How much of a traitor is our child, because they're turning their backs on their whole universe, their whole upbringing in this faith tradition, in this community, by one of them, by bringing one of them in. And yet there is this possibility of reframing, which
mhm.
I think is just so important.
Yeah. I also love so much Reverend Sam sharing what she very specifically highlighted another person's modern Orthodox rabbi said to them, if you
Hmm.
disown your child, like I hear your concern, I know that you are experiencing this as your child is being traitorous, and so you want to sit Shiva and disown them, etc., etc. It's like, however, if you do this, you lose all influence. And is that
Right.
really worth it? Right. And the same thing that that Rabbi Debbie essentially said a very similar thing to the other mother. Like, do you actually want to completely cut off contact and then no longer have any impact in your child's life?
Right. And so the
Yeah.
question about influence and how important it is for family to just continue to be in relationship with one another. It reminds me of a story, and pardon the listeners if I've shared this one before, but the story from a grandparent who was sharing a little bit about their own family situation. And when they were talking about their child marrying somebody of a different faith tradition, and the notion that I can't imagine my grandchild being of this other faith tradition, So I want them either to be fully raised in mine, meaning I think it was their son's faith tradition, or nothing at all. But that kind
Mhm.
of black and white statement, it's either this or that, makes it almost impossible to be able to live with the nuance and with the general ups and downs of life. Like the story about how Rabbi Debbie's aunt was
Mhm.
almost disowned by her own grandfather,
Right.
right? And how by virtue of him deciding to stay in a relationship by being at the wedding, that he was able to be there for her in her moment of need when that relationship did not end up working out.
Right.
Right. Like the most important thing when it comes to thinking about the role of faith is the notion of presence,
Mm.
being able to really be there, be in the moment, allow yourself to center the spirit of your connection to God, your connection to your tradition, and that by virtue of just being there, you are also able to say to your loved one, I am more than just connected to you by our faith. I'm
Mm.
connected to you because we're family and because I love you. And that
Yeah.
love is something that goes deeper than any particular faith tradition.
Yeah, indeed. And, especially in the example of being there for someone in their moment of need,
Right.
like getting married, we've talked about this before. Getting married is no small thing. And if you, as the person planning to get married, it brings a lot of questions up to you. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you want to turn to those familial, loving, trusted persons in your life, not to actually seek answers or to be told what to do, but just to vent and rave a little bit to get
Right.
all of this like stuff out of your head because it's a really big, scary, wonderful, awesome adventure that you are about to go on. And I love that you talk about presence because in order to be a vessel for
Mm,
this spirit, in order to be filled by the spirit so that God's work can happen,
right.
I have to empty myself, right?
Mm,
Whatever me as a flawed human
right.
thinks and even feels about a particular situation, it's not that my feelings don't matter at all, but for the work of the spirit to happen, to be that vessel, I
Mm,
have to let go. I have to put that stuff to the side
right.
and be willing to be filled with something else for the sake of what this other person is saying to me is their need in that moment.
Mm, right. That's the idea of being that non-anxious presence
Hmm.
because you're not worried about your own stuff there. You're able to allow the moment to be able to dictate to you how the spirit
Exactly.
is moving you.
Exactly.
I think that there's a lot of fear associated with just kind of opening yourself up to that kind of presence. Christianity and Judaism, we share the prophetic tradition
Hmm.
that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible are ones who had direct connection to God in some kind of a way. And in the Talmud, the rabbi said, yeah, so there's no longer prophecy. That doesn't exist anymore. And one of the reasons they said it is because the notion of God's presence is one where it's very personal. It's very particular. I have what I believe to be God's call in my own life. Doesn't mean it's the same call for someone else. And so then the notion of what does it mean to be, at least in this sense, a good Jew, is to see yourself as part of this larger tradition, larger faith-based community that has persevered throughout the generations, in which being simply an empty vessel waiting to hear and feel the sense of spirit is not as important as representing the tradition that you are part of. And so
Hmm.
sometimes I think it can be harder for Jews to be able to feel a sense of God's presence in the moment. That's all I got right now.
That's all you need. That's all you need. And being an empty vessel is about humility.
Right,
I am not in control. We as human beings do not have total control.
right.
I know that we've discussed in some of our other conversations from the Christian end of the room that conversion and what it means for a lot of Christians to bring people to Jesus and how whether through a marriage at the beginning or at some point in that relationship, someone who is not of the right, air quotes, faith tradition background. This would be true also for intra-Christian marriages as well. Like if a deeply evangelical family was watching their child get married to someone from a Catholic background, that also ruffles feathers.
Right.
Because they're not the right kind of Christian. And so acting out in this way by trying to say to two people who are otherwise approaching their family and friends so full of love and excitement, like, huh, we're so happy. We want to do this thing together. And we want you to stand with us. We want you to bear witness to the commitment that we are making to one another.
Right.
And how we want to build a future. Being invited into that is a very important, powerful invitation. And in some ways, it then becomes not just an invitation, but an invocation.
Gotta put that on a t-shirt. That's a good one. Not an invitation, but an invocation.
Stitched on a pillow. One of those kneeling pillows for for saying your prayers. There you go. Somebody's Etsy shop is about to blow up.
Yeah.
Like, I understand that it's no small thing.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I'm not in charge, right? Like maybe it is the Christian theological lens that I have, but like ultimately it's not up to me. Like that's what it says in scripture over and over again is that I am not the judge. My calling, my duty in this life is to bring people to Jesus, not by force and not by guilt, but through love, through acceptance, through welcoming, and by just being there, the presence, as you said it.
Right. So one of the pieces of language that I've used here before to talk about intermarriage from a Jewish context has been around idolatry. The original prohibition was do not marry these folks because they will lead your children to perform idolatry. And idolatry, as seen both through biblical and rabbinic lenses, has been associated with immorality. Clear representation of that is in Leviticus 18 when it talks about do not give your child over to Molech, that the followers of Molech were said to be profaning in every which way possible. So these are people who don't do good things. They don't do right things. And what is interesting is that as Jews got to live closer with folks from different faith backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, many Jewish leaders started to change their ways of understanding the borders between Jews and non-Jews. And in particular, focused on this idea of morality as a sign that these are actually good people. So for instance, one of the medieval rabbis who I've raised here before, and if not, I'm sure I'll raise it another point in time. His name is Menachem Ha'Meiri. He lived in France, 14th century or so. He said that when the Talmud had spoken about idolatry, it was talking about in the context of immorality, which he describes as being polluted in practices and disgusting immoral traits. However, the nations that we are living with, who are law-abiding and are free of these disgusting moral traits, there is no doubt that the laws of idolatry, which again have their root in intermarriage, that these laws of idolatry do not apply to them. That is to say, the most important thing is to be a moral person. Or to be, put it another way, a good person.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many stories I've heard about two Jews marrying, but one was a bit of an asshole to the other. And then the other person got married to a Christian who was a very good person and treated them right. That's it. That was the most important thing. And for many parents, that is the most important thing.
Exactly.
Like, is your child going to be treated the right way? Your potential grandchildren, are they going to be treated the right way?
Yeah.
And so if we can be able to change the way that we view what are the most important things about someone, moving away from here's what their religion is, which, by the way, those religions are kind of markers for, are they moral people or not? And
Yeah.
sometimes we don't realize it, but we're playing into this notion that somebody from a different faith background, different cultural background, that they're a bad person. But to
Yeah.
be open, to have that sense of spirit, to have that sense of that love, as you're mentioning, to be
Mhm.
able to be open to seeing how somebody who comes from a different place is also a good moral person, that has a sense of not invitation, but invocation, to be willing to open yourself to the possibility that this is the right partner for my child.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Mm-hmm. Not a bug, it's a feature.
It's not a bug, it's a feature. There's the dog barking.
He really wants to say something.
He has strong feelings about it.
So now we're going to transition to the story that I want to share with you, Anna, and to all of our listeners. This story comes from someone new who you've not heard from him before. His name is Josh.
My name's Josh Zippin. I have been raised Jewish, married to Kate, who is Catholic, been married for a year.
Kate, you have heard. You heard her actually twice in previous episodes. And since we were introduced to Josh by Kate in one of the previous episodes, I thought it'd be worthwhile to hear Josh now independently. So Josh is the Jewish partner.
I grew up Reconstructionist and identify very much culturally Jewish and very much part of my identity.
And you're going to hear his story about how he internalized the traitor vibe and what that really means for him.
All right. Well, I can't wait to hear a new voice.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the you're a traitor stuff, I never really felt that explicitly from other folks. I never felt that from clergy or from other people foisting that upon me. But it did feel like a thing that was sort of in my mind. Am I sort of trampling on my own values or identity in some way? Or am I minimizing myself in some way? And that was really something that I struggled with. And it's not over. When I go to church with faith, which is not every week by any means, I definitely still am challenged by that. What is my purpose here and what does it mean for me? And sometimes I'm able to sort of back out of that in a healthy way of I'm just here to support my partner and that's good enough. And I think that's largely what I hold on to as the way to make it meaningful for me now. And I don't know if that will change or evolve, but that question is an interesting one because at least as it's sort of thought about, it's easy to think that, oh, other people are going to make you feel less than, or like you're, doing something to compromise yourself. When in all honesty, I haven't had that experience with other people as much as it's been more a consideration for myself and something that I think I've grappled with. And I'm sure Kate has grappled with herself too.
So I have a certain follow-up I want to share with this story, but and I would love to get your hot take first before I do that. The one thing I will say prior to your hot take, though, is that I go back to the idea of it's not a bug, it's a feature. This actually is a feature I've heard of from a number of Jewish spouses of interfaith couples, especially men. That is to say, there is that kind of internalization of, to some degree, I feel like it's wrong, but I'm still doing it anyway. And to the point that you made during our introduction, that you have to kind of go deep and it's going to take time. It's not something that you can kind of put a bow on it and the end of a sitcom where it's all tied up nicely in the end of 25 minutes without commercials. That's not how it is. It's people kind of figuring it out over the course of their lives.
Yeah. And I love a process moment, right?
Mhm.
Like I respect any individual who is willing to not just be self-reflective, but do what Josh just did in that story and be honest about those questions that are in his head.
Right.
Because naming it is such an important part of said process that I'm always so excited to see people engaging with. I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole of process theology, I promise.
Well, we'll save that for the outtakes
Yeah, exactly. That'll be
or bonus episode, maybe.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's like a Patreon like bonus episode. It's like Anna's like 45-minute unfiltered, unhinged commentary on process theology. I sympathize so much because that line of questioning of Josh couldn't name an explicit external source, like where this concern was coming from. It was just something that he did feel like bubbling up from the inside. Like, am I doing something wrong?
Right.
The phrase he used, am I minimizing some part
Mm,
of myself? This is his internal process. It's still ongoing. And his spouse probably has had or still has
right.
questions similar to that herself, but that's her process. And it's also okay for the two of them to still have those questions as individuals. And they went ahead and got married, right? Like it didn't
Hmm.
stop him from moving forward with his life.
Right.
And this might be presumptuous, but it doesn't seem like it's getting in the way of feeling like he has a happy marriage. Like
No, in fact,
what I
right.
didn't hear in his self-reflection was regret.
Right.
It's just self-reflection.
Yeah, just wondering.
Yeah, just wondering, which quite frankly reminds me of what we just heard from the previous story in Rabbi Debbie's saying about so many couples that she's worked with. To have those questions means that you take your Jewishness, your Christianity seriously.
Right.
Because if you didn't, the questions wouldn't exist.
Right. They wouldn't be there. You wouldn't be asking them if it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't for the fact that it's something that's important to you,
Mm-hmm.
which is a nice segue to what I want to share, which is I call it a bonus story for you.
What?
Yeah. And it has to do with the internalization of the traitor vibe. The story is my own story, my story of going to church to pray.
Wow.
And so here's the backstory.
Okay.
As I was thinking more about doing more of this kind of work with interfaith families and trying to understand how you can be able to embrace two faiths under one roof and married to a wonderful Jewish woman raising beautiful Jewish kids, I would not change that for a second. But to some degree, I want to feel what would it be like as a Jew to really experience Christianity in a deeply meaningful way, and if it's even possible.
Mm.
So I said, all right, why don't you go to church to pray? And I actually took notes on it when this happened, or I should say after it happened, because it was like so intense in a certain way.
Of
And the reason
course
I'm
you did.
raising it, one of the main questions I was asking myself throughout the entire experience was, am I doing this? Am I a traitor?
Mm.
So I decided to go to a Presbyterian church that was not in my neighborhood. That was in a different neighborhood because I did not want anyone to know that I was there. At that time, I was a rabbi of a congregation and did not want anyone to know that I was thinking about doing this. I'd asked Reverend Samantha Gonzalez Block, who was ordained as a Presbyterian minister. She said, go to a Presbyterian church. So I did. Now, it was on a Sunday for obvious reasons. And I had to go to morning services at the synagogue beforehand, but it would be weird to show up to Sunday morning services in my Sunday best. So I had to be dressed in a certain way and then go home in order to get changed. But my family, who I did not tell that I was doing this beforehand, because of the internalization of the traitor vibe, I did not want to show that I was getting dressed into clothes that are worthy of church. So I left 45 minutes late to get to church. By the way, I missed almost the entire service because I didn't realize that church is an hour, like it starts on time. At a synagogue, it does not start on time. Or
Yeah.
it's the services that I'm used to, it's like a 3 hour service and like very few people are there within the first hour.
Yeah.
No.
No.
They were like, are you here for the later service? Because we don't have any more of those. I was like, no, I came for this service. And they must have looked at me like, anyway, that was a very
That's
interesting.
hilarious.
Yeah.
That's really funny.
So I also almost left my keys in the synagogue and would have locked myself out and would not have been able to go. And as I was driving, almost got stuck behind a train that was coming. The alarm was kind of going off as I was crossing the tracks. So if I was
Oh,
late by like a half a second, I would have been behind that train, would
oh
have
my
missed the
gosh.
entire service. And then, all right, this was the craziest one. And there's a jug handle turn, which I'm not sure if you've ever seen a jug handle turn, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
like it's one of those where because you're crossing two kind of major highways or major roads, and it's hard to make a left. So instead of making a left, they kind of have you go off to the right, and then you come back around in order to be able to make that left-hand
Yeah.
turn.
Yeah.
So I did the jug handle, and I got to the light. The light would not turn green. It stayed red. I kid you not. It was green right before I got there, and then it stayed red. And not just in my eyes stood red, it was red on both sides of the street. No cars, no cars could be able to move through the light.
This is hilarious.
Now, by the way, I actually came up with my own prayer to offer as a moment of meditation, of intention as to why I was doing what I was doing. And I said that prayer to myself right before I got to that light. And I was like unable to get through that light. I was like, is this God telling me don't go to church? Right? That kind of traitor vibe.
Yeah.
You hear this?
Oh, yeah. All these obstacles. It's like, no, you're not going to make it.
Right. So I end up actually finding a way somehow to turn right. And I'm zooming it in order to try to get to church for at least the last like 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so. I run through a stop sign that I did not see as one of those stop signs where there could have been a cop right there. Just so happened that there wasn't a cop, but I could have easily gotten stopped there. And then get to the light of the right before the church. Like literally, I can see the church right in front of me and the light would not turn.
Again.
So I turned to God in that moment and I said, God, yes, I actually want to go to church. So it's kind of like that other sense of all these signs are sort of pointing at don't do this, don't do that, but yet we still kind of push through. So we're talking about that humility in one sense of saying that be that kind of receptacle. Here it's like, I need to press on, even if it's actually hard. And that takes a little bit of one's own sense of what's right and wrong and willingness to kind of take that leap, so to speak, into the unknown, not knowing exactly how this was going to go. By the way, when I got in and I got the weird stare by the usher, like, why are you here 45 minutes late to an hour-long service? Finally came in, sat in the back. And it's one of these like old school colonialist churches where it has a little door that opens up the pews, but my door would not close. It literally, like, it kept on opening every time I tried to close it, as if maybe God was saying, like, just go. Like,
well, like, you're gonna cause a scene. Like people are gonna know that you're here.
Right. But I'll tell you something. I really want to go and experience what it's like to actually pray and pray with Jesus's name, just again, to see what that it's like as a Jew, as a rabbi, to be able to do that. I arrived and the prayer I had just missed was one that said the affirmation of faith in Jesus of Nazareth, true humanity was realized once for all. Jesus lived among his own people. God raised him from the dead, vindicating him as Messiah and the Lord.
Yeah.
And I got to church immediately after this prayer was said.
Yeah.
I did not have to say it. And the rest of the service, Jesus was not mentioned in that same way. However, at the very end of the service, the pastor spoke about how Jesus is described as a lamp to guide our way. And it just so happened that that previous Friday night, the weekend of me going to church, I randomly picked up a copy of a book on Jewish mysticism that I had in my library. And it spoke about Shimon Bar Yochai, who is purportedly the author of the mystical book known as the Zohar, and how Shimon Bar Yochai is said to be the lamp of God.
Yeah.
It was as if I came to this moment to see what it would feel like to be in church, fighting through that traitorous vibe that I felt within me, to go through all these different obstacles that I felt God was maybe placing in front, to come out of it actually saying, maybe what God is telling me is that you are not ready to pray in this way because this is not your way to pray. But you are here because you're trying to find a lamp leading your way to me. And I will show you that lamp because all of these ways of faith are a lamp towards me. So for me in that moment, I felt a greater connection also by virtue of what I missed and didn't have to pray. Meanwhile, to kind of bring this all back to me not telling my family, I eventually told my wife and my mother-in-law, and I would imagine that this is if I told them I cheated on my wife. Like just in terms of like the setting, like I have something to tell you.
Oh, good Lord.
Sit down.
You probably scared them so bad.
I did. And then when I told them that, they were like, not that big of a deal. Partially because I've spoken about this kind of stuff before, and so they're used to it. But at the same time, like I definitely had that fear in terms of how it would be received. And even doing this now, going to go live with our audience.
Yeah.
First time kind of really sharing it that publicly. it definitely feels a little cathartic to be able to share a story like this, but to also know that one of the reasons I'm feeling it in this way is because I care. I care
Yeah.
so much about my Judaism, what Judaism means to me, what God means to me, and that the last thing I want to do is to be a traitor. And I would say that for many interfaith families, that is the last thing that they're trying to do.
Indeed. And the desire to explore, to put yourself in the position of having an experience going to church, you were setting the bar really high. Like, I'm going to go, I'm going to say all the prayers, I'm going to do all the things that the bulletin says to do, even if it means speaking words that scare me,
Yeah.
right? Like, I hear your story and, this kind of comedy of errors, if you will, of all the things in your trying to have this secret life. I was waiting for it and I was so happy when you were like, I had to cross the tracks. It's like, of course you did. To get to the church on the other side of town where no one would
Yeah,
know you,
of course. Where
where
no
no
one would
one
know.
would recognize you. And for
Oh, wait, by the way, wait, I forgot the other part is that at the very end, I went to write down my notes and I got a little food at the local diner afterwards. And as I'm walking out, the usher is there with everyone coming for their Sunday dinner right there.
yes, immediately. And they were like,
And they're
oh,
like,
this
am I
guy.
going to see you next week? And I'm like, oh, I'm just checking things out.
That's an usher. That's an usher. That's how you know.
That's how
That's how
you
you know.
know.
Yeah. And it's just making me laugh thinking, because we all do this, or I think a lot of us do this, especially who have a particular spiritual life and understanding of God and how and why things happen in the world. And like, Ari, God
Yeah.
was not putting any obstacles in your way. Because as you said at the end of your story, which I'm going to quote like the song lyric from a praise song that I grew up with, like, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Like,
Hmm.
God is not the one out there putting obstacles in our way in order for us to have to Nickelodeon game show style get over in order to achieve something. Like,
Hmm.
now you're really a Jew. Now you're really a Christian because you made it through all the. No, the
Hmm.
obstacles are of our own making.
Hmm. I would
And
agree with that, except for the fact that all of the lights stayed red.
that's just bad
Like
urban
all of the
planning.
lights stayed red. I'm like, there's got to be something supernatural here. I'm sorry.
Maybe. Or it's just bad urban planning on a Sunday after. I don't, who knows?
But yeah, you were saying the
I
obstacles are
mean,
ourselves. Yeah, we're the obstacles before like we set ourselves up. We put a lot of
yeah.
meaning and emphasis, and there's a lot of good that comes out of it, but there can also
Hmm.
be a lot of challenges and a lot of bad things that happen by virtue of saying like what happens if I choose this person over that person? What
Yeah.
happens if I make this choice in my life over that choice?
Yeah.
And how much angst, how
Hmm.
much potential pain are we causing ourselves when it's not that necessary?
Yeah.
Because God gave us life and wants us to choose life and not death. And so part of the idea of what is a mitzvah, what is God commanding us, is if it gives us more life. And if that is that lamp that can help guide us,
Hmm.
lighting our way, then there are plenty of things that we can do to experience that light without feeling the worry and the pain that comes by imagining the obstacles that are of our own making.
Hmm.
And yet, I would say that those obstacles I felt were also important because they reaffirmed how important my Judaism is to me.
Yes, absolutely. The process was important and where it led you being affirmed, in a sense, like being validated. It wasn't just an experience of like, phew, oh yeah, I can do that. I can tolerate like sitting through a church service. Like, no, that's
No.
not what you got out of it. That wasn't the point. It wasn't what you were seeking. And that's not what happened. You were left with a reminder of what is really important to you.
Mm, yeah, that is true. And ultimately, isn't that what faith is supposed to do? Right, we're talking about these stories and coming back to the first one from Rabbi Debbie about how the mother was saying, "What did I do wrong?" And it's
Mhm.
not what you do wrong, it's actually what you do right.
Exactly.
It's what you do right in instilling in your children what is the lamp that is going to guide them? It looks different. It feels different in every generation. It's not about what it is that you can tolerate. I can't tolerate the word tolerance. It's more about what it means to be able to embrace the unknown and to allow the unknown to unfold before you, right? Like being that empty vessel so the spirit can come.
Right.
Like being able to say the obstacles are of my own creation. And also to say, even though this may make me uncomfortable, I'm still going to arrive at the wedding. I'm still going to be here because my presence here is important.
Exactly. And like we heard Josh say for himself as a person grappling with these questions in his interfaith relationship, to say, I may feel these things and it might even make me feel afraid, but I'm not going to be dictated by that fear.
Right.
I'm not going to actually make the choices of my life based on fear, either desperately trying to avoid it or some type of survival mode. It's to say, in spite of the fear that I feel, there's also something else that is pulling me in this direction that is love.
Yes, the role that love plays in all of this. That is a topic we should continue to explore more. Wow. Well, this was
that's a heck of a part 1.
So stay tuned for part 2 next week because it gets even better. All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of episode 5, You're a Traitor.
We hope you learned and laughed with us.
Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss part 2.
We want to thank our supporters and contributors, our families, and all of our featured storytellers.
We also want to give a special shout out to our composer and music producer, Pablo Langang.
Subscribe, share, leave a review, and send us a message. We would love to hear your feedback and to learn more of your stories.
Find us on any of your podcast platforms to subscribe, and you can also find us on interfaithingpod.com.
Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And if you really like what you hear, please consider supporting us financially at patreon.com/interfaithing.
So until we meet again, take care.
Stay curious.
And
keep
keep
interfaithing.